So you think the Colosseum was just dangerous for gladiators? Think again. The spectators were dying too, and the weird part? The richer you were, the more likely you were to get hurt. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Going to the games wasn't just entertainment, it was literally risking your life. Look, the Romans had this system. Front row seats called the podium, reserved for senators, important officials, and those Vestal virgins everyone's heard about. Basically, the most powerful people in Rome. Makes sense, right? Important people get the best seats. That's normal. Well, here's the thing. In Rome, your seat showed everyone exactly how powerful you were. The closer you sat to the arena, the more important you looked. It was like wearing a badge that screamed, "I'm a big deal." So the elite wanted to be as close as possible. We're talking maybe 15 feet from where gladiators were swinging swords around, close enough to see everything, hear everything, smell everything. The Romans called these seats prima cavia. The first section, most important spot in the entire building. If you ask me, it sounds amazing. Front row to the biggest show in the ancient world. Fancy marble seats, servants bringing you wine, watching all the action right there. But here's what's weird about old Roman writings. They always say sitting in the podium was immersive. They talk about how you could really feel what was happening, how it was totally different from sitting anywhere else. Immersive. Strange word to use. Well, there's a reason they had doctors standing around the podium during games, and it wasn't for the fighters down in the arena. The Romans built the most advanced entertainment place in history. Perfect design, amazing engineering, everything planned to show off Roman power. But here's what they didn't think about. When you're sitting that close to total chaos, you're not just watching anymore. You become part of the show. And during the morning events, something often seemed to go wrong. So, what exactly went wrong during those morning shows? Let's talk about the Romans' brilliant idea to import deadly animals from across the entire empire. Lions from Africa, bears from Germany, leopards from Asia, all crammed into underground cages beneath the arena floor. What could possibly go wrong? Look, the Romans thought they had everything figured out. They built these elaborate systems. Trenches around the arena, wooden fences, trapdoors, all designed to keep the animals exactly where they belonged. In theory, it was foolproof. The animals would come up through the floor, do their thing, and everyone would be perfectly safe behind the barriers. But here's the thing about wild animals. They don't really care about Roman engineering. Well, Roman writers mention these unexpected moments during the morning hunts. They talk about how the games were thrilling and unpredictable. They use words like surprising and dramatic. Funny how they never explain what made it so surprising. If you ask me, when historians keep using vague words like that, they're usually hiding something. And the Romans were definitely hiding something about these animal shows. Here's what we do know. The trenches weren't always deep enough. The fences weren't always strong enough. And sometimes the trapdoor operators made mistakes. Big mistakes. Those fancy barriers the Romans built, they worked great against animals that stayed calm. But panic changes everything. A terrified lion doesn't think about following the rules. And when you're sitting 15 feet away from chaos, those safety measures start looking pretty flimsy. The Romans brought in animals that had never seen humans before, creatures that were already stressed, confused, and angry from being trapped in dark cages for weeks. Then they expected these wild beasts to perform on cue in front of 50,000 screaming people. Turns out, sometimes the animals had other plans. When a lion decides it doesn't want to fight a gladiator, it starts looking for easier targets, like the people in fancy togas sitting in the front row. But wait until you hear what happened when the gladiators themselves started losing control. Animals escaping was one thing. But the afternoon gladiator shows, that's where things got really messy for the rich folks. Picture this. You're a Roman senator, sitting in your marble seat, sipping wine. Below you, two trained killers are going at each other with razor-sharp weapons. Sounds safe enough, right? After all, these guys are professionals, except professional fighters bleed. A lot. When a gladiator gets sliced open with a sword, that blood doesn't magically disappear. It sprays, it splatters, and gravity works the same way in ancient Rome as it does today. Those front row senators weren't just watching the violence, they were getting covered in it. The Romans had different types of gladiators. Myrmidons with their heavy shields and swords, retiari throwing nets and stabbing with tridents. Each fight style meant different weapons flying around in different directions. Now here's something interesting. Roman sources describe how gladiators would sometimes dedicate their performance to honored guests. They'd fight closer to certain sections of the podium as a sign of respect. Sounds nice until you realize what that actually meant. These fighters were bringing their bloody, violent combat right up to the barrier, separating them from the spectators. Imagine sitting there in your expensive toga while two guys are hacking at each other just a few feet away. Every sword swing sends droplets flying. Every stumble brings the fighters closer to your seat. And let's talk about those weapons for a second. Gladiator gear wasn't exactly precision equipment. Swords would chip and break during combat. Net weights could go flying. Tridents had those nasty three-pronged tips that could easily slip from sweaty hands. The Romans loved to brag about their engineering. They built drainage systems under the arena to handle all the blood. They had crews ready to rake fresh sand over the mess between fights. But you know what they couldn't engineer away? Physics. When two people are fighting for their lives with metal weapons, stuff goes flying. Blood, sweat, pieces of armor, sometimes even chunks of flesh. And that debris has to land somewhere. Guess where it usually ended up? Right on top of the people who paid the most to be there. But even that wasn't the worst part of going to the games. Wait until you hear about Execution Day. Blood from gladiator fights was bad enough. But midday executions? That's when Roman entertainment hit a whole new level of brutal. The Romans didn't just kill criminals, they turned it into theater. Elaborate productions where condemned prisoners would be forced to act out death scenes from mythology. Getting torn apart by wild animals was considered light entertainment, and the elite couldn't look away, literally. See, attending these executions wasn't optional for senators and magistrates. It was part of their civic duty. Show up, sit in your assigned seat, and prove you had the stomach for Roman justice, even if that justice was happening 15 feet in front of your face. The Romans got creative with their execution methods. They'd recreate famous myths where people died horrible deaths. Criminals would play Orpheus getting ripped apart by bears, or Daedalus being burned alive, complete with costumes and props. Sometimes they'd execute political prisoners, former allies who fell out of favor, disgraced nobles who backed the wrong emperor. These weren't random criminals. These were people the elite spectators probably knew personally. Imagine watching your former colleague get mauled by lions while you're forced to sit there and act like it's perfectly normal entertainment. The worst part? The Romans designed these executions to be as messy as possible. Maximum blood, maximum screaming, maximum spectacle. They wanted everyone to see what happened to people who crossed Rome. But they also wanted their most important citizens right there in the splash zone. Roman writers describe how these midday shows were educational for the ruling class, how witnessing this level of violence taught important lessons about Roman power and justice. Educational. Right, what they don't mention is how senators would sometimes excuse themselves midway through executions. Sudden illnesses, emergency Senate meetings, anything to get away from the carnage. Because watching people you knew get torn apart by wild animals while their blood literally landed on your clothes, that leaves a mark. And speaking of marks, wait until you find out what happened when the crowd itself became the danger. Gladiators, animals, executions, all dangerous. But 50,000 angry Romans, that was the real nightmare scenario. Roman crowds were passionate about their games. They'd bet huge amounts of money on fights. They had favorite gladiators they'd scream for. And when things didn't go their way, they got violent. Fast. Take what happened in Pompeii in 59 AD. A routine gladiator match between local fighters and visitors from a nearby town. Standard entertainment. Should have been completely safe. Instead, it turned into a full-scale riot. Fans started throwing rocks. Then knives came out. People died in the stands that day, not in the arena, but in the audience. The emperor banned gladiator games in Pompeii for 10 years after that disaster. Now imagine that same energy, but inside the Colosseum with its steep seating levels and limited exits. When crowds panicked, people got crushed. When fights broke out, there was nowhere to run. And guess who got trapped in the worst spots during these riots? The rich folks in the front rows. Here's why the podium became a death trap during crowd violence. Those VIP sections had separate entrances from the regular seating. Fancy private tunnels that connected directly to the arena level. Great for showing off your status. Terrible for emergency evacuations. When riots started in the upper levels, debris would rain down on the people below. Chunks of stone, pieces of wood, anything angry fans could throw. But the real danger came when panicked crowds tried to escape. Everyone stampeded toward the exits at once. The narrow staircases couldn't handle the crush of people, bodies piled up in the passageways. And the elite, they were stuck at the bottom with limited escape routes, trapped between the arena wall and thousands of panicking spectators pushing down from above. Roman engineers built an amazing structure, but they never planned for what happened when their own people turned the building into a weapon. Even if you survived the riots, though, you still weren't safe, because the Colosseum itself was trying to kill you. You might think being poor in ancient Rome meant safer seats. Wrong. The upper levels had their own deadly problems. Wooden construction in the top tiers meant constant fire risks, heat from 50,000 people, oil lamps for lighting, and wooden benches that had been sitting in the Mediterranean sun for hours. One spark could turn the entire upper section into a furnace. Roman engineers were brilliant, but they weren't miracle workers. Supporting that much weight, thousands of people plus the massive awning system they used for shade pushed ancient building techniques to their limits. Structural collapses weren't theoretical, they happened, especially during packed events when people squeezed into spaces designed for smaller crowds. Wooden beams would crack under the stress, support posts would shift, entire sections of seating would give way without warning. Then there's the heat factor. Rome gets hot in summer, and sitting in direct sunlight for 8 hours straight would drop people regularly. Dehydration, heat stroke, fainting spells. Medical emergencies were constant in the upper levels. But here's the kicker about those safer cheap seats. When animals did escape the arena, they didn't always run toward the exits. Panicked wild animals would sometimes bolt upward, looking for any way out of the noise and chaos. A terrified leopard climbing the arena wall toward the upper tiers. Yeah, that happened. The social hierarchy that put rich people in danger down below created different problems up top. Poor citizens were packed together like sardines. No personal space, no reserved seating, no escape routes when things went bad. And when structural failures occurred, guess who got crushed first? The people who couldn't afford better seats. So there you have it, rich or poor, front row or back, the Colosseum was basically a death trap with entertainment. The Romans built the most spectacular arena in history, then filled it with every possible way to die. Makes you wonder why 50,000 people kept showing up, doesn't it?